And we're very fortunate today to have Terry Hartig from Uppsala University to give us a presentation on restoration and nature beyond the conventional narrative. And Terry, I wonder if you might be able to just say a few words about yourself and your areas of interest, and then get on with the talk. We have about an hour, so Terry will give his talk, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that I'll lead. So Terry, are you, if you go ahead, I'll just keep time to make sure that we're running to give some people a chance to ask some questions at the end. So welcome, Terry.
Okay, well, thank you, Ian, and thank you and the other organizers for working to put this all together, for the invitation to come and present and have this discussion today. It's a pity we can't meet in person, but it is what it is. My background is eclectic. You can say that it spans the behavioral, social, and health sciences. So it's training in experimental psychology and social epidemiology and social ecology at the University of California, and then work with housing and urban issues here at the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Uppsala University since 1996. So I'm going to be bringing quite a number of different issues into focus here today. I do want to address the point, though. Some of you may have been anticipating a presentation on environmental design, planning, and policy measures that promote health and well-being. And in fact, I will be touching on environmental design, planning, and policy measures as I go along, of diverse kinds. Some that have to do with the physical environment, some that have to do with the social environment, and some that have to do with how we structure time in societies. Now, what I'm going to present on restoration in nature beyond the conventional narrative is a chapter that I've just recently published. It's going to be coming out as open access in a book on psychology and nature. And this is a product of my COVID experience, I could say. I was supposed to have a sabbatical last year, and instead I sat at my kitchen table at home and I wrote this very long theoretical chapter that I needed to write, and I finally was able to do it. So I'm one of these people who fortunately could make something good of this terrible pandemic. Now, let me begin by offering a broad context for this work. A broad context, bear this in mind. This is a context-setting problem description. Many people today express alarm at the loss to urbanization of possibilities for experiencing nature, and so of the contributions to the health that come through nature experiences. Now, my guess is that many of you are very familiar with this problem description. And in fact, it sets the context for many, many different kinds of studies in the behavioral and social and health sciences. Now, when I speak about restoration, I'm speaking about a process that's addressed in many of these studies introduced with this kind of problem description. But many studies are talking about the inability of people to come into natural environments for restorative experiences, supported by what we would consider to be an absence of the things that we have in built environments. Now, writing about restoration, restorative experience in natural settings, as something that's of concern here and addressed with this problem description, I want to emphasize that working from this perspective is at present rather limited. People can be working from this perspective in much broader ways. And this is what I want to do in this chapter. What I set out to do is to show more of the potential of the restoration perspective. The restoration perspective on human adaptation offers a broad view of relations between environment and health. However, it remains underutilized as a source of insight for nature and health studies. In this chapter, I start from the restoration perspective in showing ways to extend theory and research concerned with the benefits of nature experience. And I might add that I am also indicating how we can, with this knowledge of theory and research, identify additional practical applications. So the storyline runs something like this. I'll tell you what the restoration perspective is, and then I'll talk about the conventional narrative that I refer to in the title of this presentation. Conventional narrative built around two particular theories, mainly having to do with psychological processes. Then I will identify a general framework underlying the narrative, a general theoretical framework that helps us to identify general components of theories about restorative experience. And then I will extend the framework by adding two additional theories, going up in levels of analysis from the individual to the dyad or small group, and then to the community. And with that extended framework, then I indicate how we can extend a narrative about nature experience, restoration, and health. So first then, the restoration perspective. We can think of the restoration perspective as one of three perspectives on adaptation as a superordinate process joining people and the environment. So many of us are familiar with thinking around stress and coping, and restoration is a third aspect of adaptation that we can appreciate complements stress and coping as providing a more complete understanding. So each of these perspectives can be defined in terms of a theoretical premise and a practical premise. So for example, the theoretical premise for the stress perspective, heavy demands can undermine adaptation. The practical premise, then interventions can eliminate or mitigate demands. And I would suggest to you that we can in fact apply these perspectives in looking at very much human activity over the course of history, into prehistory, into our evolutionary history. That the development of human capability has involved to a very great extent identifying demands, reacting to them, responding to them, and working to eliminate or mitigate them. So if we're freezing outside in the rain, we seek shelter in a cave, just to begin with. The restoration perspective complements the stress and coping perspectives because it recognizes that you cannot eliminate or mitigate demands, all of them. You cannot enhance the availability of resources for coping with demands. That, in fact, adaptation will require periodic restoration because we create demands for ourselves. And that is part of our developmental process in human social and cultural evolution. So we, for example, encourage young people to go to university to learn more. They take upon themselves the demands of higher education. And there are many demands that we create for ourselves that we welcome. So the restoration perspective is complementing stress and coping perspective by recognizing that we are always going to have demands. Some of these are demands we want, value, and we need to ensure possibilities, opportunities for restoration. Now, in recent years, there has been a very tight connection made between access to nature, nature experience, and restoration. And this brings me to the particular relevance of the restoration perspective for understanding health values of nature experience. Put simply, its relevance for understanding health values assigned to nature experience owes in large part to the probabilities of people having particular kinds of experiences in particular activities, in particular settings, at particular times. I'm going to make this a little bit more real here in a moment. I just would like to add here that these probabilities align with the common opposition of urban and natural environments in terms of stress and restoration. So we all understand that we have this movement into urban settings, an increasing concentration of global human population in urban settings. And there is a kind of antithesis that is getting reinforced between the urban and the natural. And we have a concentration of productive activities in urban settings for the increasing proportion of the human population. So that when people go to nature, whatever they define to be nature, they are going to it during time that they have away from those productive activities, during time they have for restoration. So I do not mean to suggest that nature is restorative for all people at all times. It's absolutely not what I want to do. There are still people who work on the land, they face their daily demands on the land, they have a different understanding of nature. But for a growing proportion of the human population living in cities, going to nature is something they do for recreational activities that serve, among other things, restoration. Now, what do I mean by restoration? I'm going to give you a little bit more background in that. And doing that, I'm going to give you some background also to this conventional narrative about restorative effects of nature experience. The conventional narrative is built around two theories: attention restoration theory and psychoevolutionary theory, each of which is concerned with a particular antecedent condition, that is, a condition from which people may need restoration. So some people may exercise the capacity to concentrate, to direct their attention in everyday life, to willfully and effortfully focus on tasks. For example, doing mental work. And over time, this capacity to direct attention may become fatigued. People may make errors in performance. They may become insensitive to cues from others, and so on. So there are some real costs to the loss of this ability to direct attention. Now, that antecedent condition may overlap with the condition of concern in psychoevolutionary theory, which is also referred to as stress reduction or stress recovery theory. That's concerned with psychophysiological stress. In this most acute sense, this is when people become physiologically activated to meet some immediate demand. You can think of the fight or flight response. Now, these two antecedent conditions may overlap. So a person may experience acute stress and may be focusing intensively on some mental work because they have some deadline to meet. But the theories approach them as separate antecedent conditions. And these are antecedent conditions that are often described in work around these theories as characteristic of urban life. So people living in cities are facing these heavy demands on their attention capacity. They're experiencing a lot of stress as they're going about their daily rounds. And then the discussion then has to do with how they can restore or recover from these antecedents. Attention restoration theory posits that one is away, gains a sense of being away from demands on attention, and that they can go to a setting where there are features in the environment that will attract and hold attention without effort. So when a person can be fascinated by something in the environment, they can rest the cognitive mechanism on which directed attention depends. And then extent and compatibility have to do with the extent of the environment in which they can be engaged, allowing for the perpetuation of fascination. Compatibility has to do with a match between what they want to do, can do, and must do in the environment. So extent and compatibility have to do with prolonging these experiences of being away in fascination. And the authors of this theory, Stephen and Rachel Kaplan, argue that going to nature experience, particularly affords these kinds of experiences of being away and fascination. People can go to nature, get away from demands, become fascinated by the beauty of nature, exploring the processes that they see underway there, and so forth. Now, some of this overlaps with what we see described in psychoevolutionary theory as components of environmental experience working in restoration. So first of all, absence of threat. Person is safe. Then there are natural environmental contents that the author would argue we have become biologically prepared to appreciate and value because they have served, they are symbols of survival serving features of the environment of hominin prehistory. And then there are visual stimulus attributes that we can look at. So this is a theory very much about what people are seeing in the environment. And then each of these theories refers to outcomes that can tell us that restoration has occurred. So if we're looking at people who are suffering from directed attention fatigue, after spending some time in a natural environment, do we see that they then perform better on standardized tests of cognitive abilities? Or do we see that blood pressure and cortisol go down, or more positive emotions are being expressed if they have been feeling stressed beforehand? So these are the two theories of the conventional narrative. And I can tell you that they get used a lot, that there are many, many studies that in one way or another refer to these two theories. And we can see that this research takes on a variety of strategies in expanding the field. So some of them are looking at basic sampling issues, sampling of people or environments, levels of stress and attentional fatigue, sampling of temporal parameters like how long are they in the environment, all having to do with issues of external validity and boundary conditions. And then we have matters of construct and internal validity and process description. So studies, often experimental, that try to address the processes described in these theories. So we have some ideas that these are plausible mechanisms at work, but there's continuing conceptual elaboration of those, along with improvements in measurement, improvements in research design, and then measurement and testing of mediators that can represent the processes. So there's been a tremendous growth in research organized around this conventional narrative of the two theories. Oftentimes one or the other only, but more often reference to both of them, trying to understand restorative effects of natural environment experience or nature experience. Well, it concerns me that we have a conventional narrative, because a conventional narrative, while it can be helpful in a variety of ways, for example, as a basis for forming a community, people organize around the idea that we know these two theories and we work with them in common. It may also be exclusive and limiting. So a narrative is not exactly a theory or even a body of theory. It overlaps with, to a large degree, encompasses them, but then we have theory as a body of theory and then specific theories that lie outside of the narrative. And then we have the additional aspects of the narrative that we need to take into consideration. So an additional aspect of a narrative could be this problem-setting context description, like we started with. So urbanization means a loss of opportunities to experience nature. Well, if we want to advance the field, we might want to think about the adequacy of that problem description. There might be other problem descriptions that we need to refer to. There may be other components that we need to bring into a body of theories. There may be criticisms of a theory that we can identify when we expanded body of theories, and so forth. So here we have movement across these three ways of representing the collection of knowledge and communication of knowledge and understanding. So to expand this narrative, to go beyond the conventional narrative, I propose a strategy, rather straightforward strategy. We work from the general theoretical framework that underlies the narrative. So here we have our two theories identified before, SRT and ART. And I've broken them down in terms of these different components that you've already seen. But here I've suggested that, well, look, we can think about the resource identified by each of them, the adaptive resource, and then raise the question, are there other adaptive resources that we are not attending to? So a possible theory then refers to some other ability aside from mobilizing for action, as in fight or flight, some other ability other than directing attention as addressed in attention restoration theory. And so we can start asking questions. We have a general theoretical framework. We have a way to identify openings for new theorizing. So we can extend the framework. And in this chapter, Restoration in Nature Beyond the Conventional Narrative, I suggest that we can extend the framework by looking first at resources not only in individuals, but resources held between individuals. So I've been told that these figures look kind of creepy. These are sort of standard Microsoft Office figures. So I don't know, there's some evil genius at Microsoft who's proposed these, I suppose. But I kind of like them because they reflect human imperfection. And at the same time, the kind of warmth and the open arms that so many of us would like to extend to others despite the pandemic. And this is in part the point, that our ability to meet the demands of everyday life, basic adaptive resource, is our ability to rely on others for support, for help. And the theories of the conventional narrative acknowledge these in ways, but they don't really address the resource itself. So individual stress may have implications for one's relationships with others, but it's not in attention restoration theory or psychoevolutionary theory dealing with what happens when the relational resource itself becomes weaker. For example, a relational resource like trust or liking, love, mutual regard, shared memories. These are things that are not held within individuals, they are held between individuals. And we need to be concerned, I argue, with how these resources can be built up and can be depleted. Which leads me to propose a theory about restoration of relational resources. So here we have a third theory in our extended general theoretical framework, relational restoration theory. It's concerned with now a different level of analysis. So I have added a component to the framework, level of analysis. The level of analysis, the dyad or small group. The resource of interest, ability to rely on each other for support. The antecedent condition of concern, strained or weakened relationship with some other. And then we can start talking about how environments can support restoration of a relational resource. Environments including the natural environment. So arrangements for supportive exchange that enable distancing from demand. Now, arrangements for supportive exchange, this is an important term in the context. The theories of the conventional narrative, they're focused on individuals. And they largely assume that the individual just goes out to this place and is somehow there. But I think many of us, if not all of us, appreciate that oftentimes when we are going out to nature for restoration, we are doing so with someone else or having made an agreement with someone else that we are going to do that and that we will be coming back at some time. So these are arrangements that people make. And in fact, they may make stable arrangements that persist over a long time. So perhaps somebody is in a marriage and one person understands that my partner, my husband, my wife must go off every weekend for some hours alone to the forest or to the field or to the seashore. And that is something that we allow in our arrangements. Now, those arrangements are for enabling distance. Some of those arrangements, though, can enhance engagement with the setting. For example, telling that person, darling, I love you, go off and enjoy your time in the forest. Don't worry about the things that need to be done here at home. They'll get taken care of. We'll do that later. Go off and get some rest. Clear your mind. Wind down. Or perhaps they go together, and perhaps that's a regular part of their standing arrangements. And perhaps that's something that in doing together, it amplifies the benefits of individual engagement. So amplification of engagement through sharing of experience is something that's not dealt with in the theories of the conventional narrative. And yet we can appreciate that this is something that is happening quite often. You have, for example, in a couple, two people go out, they're getting away from work, each is winding down, clearing their minds, and yet at the same time, perhaps they talk about the issues of the week, things that they need to take care of. They can see the things that they find to be beautiful together. Now here I'm, of course, presenting a rather idealistic picture. Things can go terribly, terribly wrong, but I would rather have this positive picture of how it can develop. We can see this reflected in outcomes, for example, like greater marital stability or satisfaction, or if we're not looking at family units, we might think of work group cohesion. Here also we have a concern for time, and the concern for time here is concern for time spent together and apart across situations in these standing arrangements for supportive exchange. All right, this is very abstract, I understand. And I have to say the chapter that I wrote is long, and I think the word that I use to describe it most often is it's chewy. And you're getting it very, very quickly. You're getting a lot to chew on, but I'm going to actually give you a bit more to chew on, and I'm hoping you're not just going to choke and throw it all back at me. So please bear with me, because in fact, we can move up another level of analysis. And this has to do with the fact that individuals are not alone. They're in relationships with others. And in fact, what is happening in one relationship has implications for others. And this can spread through a community. And at one person's grief or sorrow can have implications for quite many people. One person's stress, one person's need for help can have implications for many others. One person's optimism and ability to help can have implications for many others. So we want to take into consideration another level of analysis, the community or population, another resource, the ability to rely on possibly unknown others for support. We want to be concerned with an aggregated depletion of individual and shared relational resources. Now, this is a terrible abstraction that actually, I think, describes what many of us understand is happening now with the pandemic. That we've been dealing with isolation of different kinds for quite a long time. And there's a kind of sense that we need to come back to our contacts with so many others. Now here, when we talk about features of person-environment transactions that permit and promote restoration, we can think of institutional arrangements that allow relaxation of demands on a large proportion of the community or population. and that allow for shared activities. For example, conviviality among those present in public places. So I can tell you that here in Uppsala now, we have warm weather and the restrictions of the pandemic have been lifted. And people are sitting outside at the cafes and restaurants, and it is like letting the cows out of the barn. People have just been flooding out. They have been longing for this to such an extent. And that has been permitted by the institutional arrangements for public health now. We can anticipate that the outcomes that we're looking at are not only the individual outcomes, but a kind of positive emotional contagion and spread of benefits. I'm going to give you an example of this. I mentioned early on that here we're talking about planning, policy, design measures. One of these in Sweden, you could say, is vacation legislation. Vacation legislation, which makes it the worker's right to, during the period 1st of June, 31st of August, take 4 consecutive weeks of vacation. And that vacation legislation evolved because people in Sweden wanted not only the time for vacation, but they wanted it concentrated in those months of the year when they could spend most of their time outdoors, because they thought that was best for restoration. And you can see from these data that in fact, people are using that vacation time allocation in a quite regular way. Here we're talking vacationing workers in 10,000. So you can anticipate that here you have roughly 2 million people on vacation from work in July out of a population of roughly 10 million now. I mean, that over the time period here, it's varied a bit. That's a very large proportion of the population leaving work and going out to oftentimes natural settings for restoration. And it's not only a matter of the number of people, it's the fact also that these peaks of vacationing, it's also, they're taking more time. And with that more time, then they can gather in a greater variety of social constellations, meet more other people. So there's a greater potential for a spread of positive emotions, willingness to help, and so forth among people in the population. Now, in the particular study where we presented these data, we also identified a kind of nonlinear association between vacationing and dispensation of antidepressants to the Swedish population. We also saw that dispensation of antidepressants was reduced among people outside of the working population. So even people not on vacation would have been benefiting from what was happening in the population. Well, I think my time is pretty much up here. I'm going to skip ahead very quickly, just to say that talking about these different theories, we can appreciate that they're not in isolation, that there is bidirectional influence, moving up and down levels of analysis. So individual stress recovery ultimately has implications for collective restoration. Collective restoration ultimately has implications for individual stress recovery. And these processes are underway all the time. So we extend the narrative. More encompassing and, in my view, more accurate narrative would have a context-setting problem description that does not force urbanization and nature preservation into some necessary opposition, but rather emphasizes how further development of urban environments can proceed as a component of human evolution in which we coordinate our needs with those of other forms of life. And I say this because the two theories of the extended theoretical framework are both very much about resources we share among us. The individual level theories talk about individual level resources, and they neglect how human evolution has been evolution of people together, and how we have developed social resources to manage the demands of everyday life, as couples, friends, in work groups, in larger communities. Right, these are my final words. The studies I just raced past, they're tremendously interesting and so forth. I recommend them all to you. They're readily available as well. The conventional narrative about restorative effects of nature experience became conventional for good reasons, and it has served research and practice well in many ways. This said, I see good reasons to move toward a more encompassing narrative, one that respects the historical and lasting values of SRT and ART and honors the efforts of their authors, while also acknowledging the limitations of those theories and calling attention to a broader range of phenomena, problems, and possible solutions. This will make more of the potential of the restoration perspective. And that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. That was a really interesting talk, and it was great to see the work that you did on your sabbatical at your kitchen table. So Terry, you might recall Gordon Oriens and various others looked at the shape of trees and possible escape terrain as an evolutionary idea about what we find as beauty in nature. In relation to your particular perspective, we might expect to see differences between the individual and the collective in terms of our view of beauty, and because of its evolutionary importance in terms of selection and adaptation. Have you thought about how you translate the ideas that you have about individual relationships and communities in terms of how an evolutionary history of beauty in nature might play out, or beauty in even the urban environment might play out?
Well, thank you, Ian, for the question. And in fact, the two theories that I referred to, the theories of the conventional narrative, are built on theorizing that is of a kind with that of Gordon Oriens and others, the Savannah hypothesis, the prospect refuge theory, and so forth. They're all aligning with the notion that people have acquired preferences through evolutionary time and have retained some of those. We have biological preparedness to like certain conditions. It's become to a great extent popularized in recent years with respect to this notion of biophilia. So in fact, if you go into the literature, you'll appreciate that E.O. Wilson's thinking about biophilia is informed by the work of Gordon Oriens. In fact, his basic rationale is very much like that of J. Appleton, a geographer, who was laying out how in what we consider to be art today, we see much of this kind of evolutionary heritage, if you will, preserved. People find landscape paintings with open landscapes to be particularly appealing. So that's always been there, but I think we give away too much when we would like to describe all of this as extremely hardwired, that we see that there is a lot of variation across individual developmental stages and across cultures.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is not deterministic.
No, I think it's problematic if we want to see this as just something that's innate and pre-programmed.
Right.
It's highly variable, and some of that has to do with the fact that we haven't evolved just as these solitary individuals on the savannah. And I think much of the discussion and theorizing in psychology focused on individuals is neglecting that. We have other areas in psychology where they're very much talking about the evolution of cooperation.
Yeah.
And so that we have a kind of critique of the urban environment as being unsuited because of how we've evolved in what we now consider to be natural environments. But this neglects how people are together with other people in urban environments. So in some sense, you could say that the urban environment is the most adaptive for us. But that's definitely not part of the conventional narrative.
Yeah.
Urban bad, nature good. But it's a story about what we could think of as unnecessary features of urban environments. are cars and car exhaust and all of that, are those necessary features? Or is it being together with other people, engaged in cooperative activity and reproducing, that are the necessary features of urban environments? So this is a kind of shift that I would like to see happen, and try to encourage that with this chapter.
So agoraphobia, right? You know, you have a very positivist attitude in terms of the way in which you present your talk, but nature is not safe and restorative to everyone, right? And there are people with agoraphobia, and so how do you engage that variation into your narrative?
Well, thank you again for another good question. You know, I often meet groups of people who are very much sold on the idea that nature is good for you. And I don't want to be too discouraging, but I find myself compelled to remind them that the greater part of research on nature and health has to do with infectious diseases or natural catastrophes. To remind people that nature, if we want to think about nature in some more respectful way and not just the pretty bushes and things, that nature has been making us sick and killing us all along in very, very large numbers. And in fact, that's been driving adaptation. So yes, some nature experience is good, but I think this is a challenge for us to think about the paradox that by trying to promote the idea that nature is good for us, we are promoting a diminished view of nature. And we need to have this, I think, a more encompassing view of what nature is, and appreciate how it makes us sick and kills us, and how we need to have respect for it in this, to understand our unavoidable continuous immersion in nature as part of these processes.
And then if bringing that into the current situation with a pandemic, I mean, to a certain extent, there's that juxtaposition between nature has provided us with the ingredients of a pandemic, at the same time as nature is a thing that we purportedly crave to engage with, right? As a way of restoring this feeling of isolation and the context of the urban situation that many people find themselves in. So nature is not just one particular thing.
Yeah, boy, there's so much to discuss with regard to the nature concept. Of course, I'm guessing that all of the listeners here appreciate that it's multifaceted, and people have been talking about this over the course of history, because we're trying to understand who we are in nature, find our place in nature. And that's been a challenge for societies all along. That's been a concern. This fact has been of concern to anthropologists for a long time. So how do we find a respectful place or stance toward our place in nature, and how we behave, and the implications of our behavior? Here we are gathered on Zoom. We're sitting in widely separated locations. And this is something we would not have been doing a year and a half ago, because we didn't know about these technological capabilities. So here we have had this tremendous social learning process forced upon us by nature, or by how we have behaved in nature in such a way that we have brought this new virus into our biological, however I should describe it, the biome that's affecting us most immediately. So I think we count the dead from COVID-19, but we're also counting a lot of learning that we're going to be taking with us that also has implications for the environment, for our relations with nature.
Yeah, so the survivors will be very different people from what they were a year and a half, 2 years ago. how would you what would be different? How would you test for that difference between the individual and the group benefit, right? So you're arguing a lot for there being this group benefit from the ways in which we look at restorative activities and actions. How would you test that is different from being driven by an individual requirement?
Yeah, we understand that much of outdoor recreation is not individual recreation. We have many studies in many different places that attest to this. People are often not going alone. They're often going with family members. And that may lead to, for example, the development of communication between parents and children. So we can look at patterns of communication between fathers and sons or mothers and daughters. There are experimental studies on how shared pleasures are double pleasures in a sense, or amplified pleasures. So in a variety of ways, we can see how the presence and engagement of two people together is enhancing not only their individual outcomes, but something that is integral to their relationship. For example, the communication. This is a very odd study, but it's a study looking at variation over time in the Swedish population in two outcomes that we do not expect to be related at first glance. One of these is suicide among women of childbearing age, and the other is selection against male twins in utero. Now, I should say the lead author on this, Ralph Catalano, is a professor of public health at the University of California, Berkeley, and these others here are students who are at these different affiliated universities, also most of them working with birth outcomes. And much of this has to do with the notion of selection in utero. So much of the thinking around natural selection emphasizes the selective processes working when people mature and they pair up with someone else and pass their genes in that way. Selection in utero has to do with which fetuses are selected out. And a large part of the work of Ralph Catalano has been to identify how birth outcomes vary with variations in the environment that can affect the entire population. For example, wars, consumer confidence, natural catastrophes, political assassinations. So there are many studies that he and these colleagues and myself have done that have looked at population level birth outcomes. And this is important because this is one kind of mechanism that speaks to how also natural selection can be proceeding more quickly and in ways that we can anticipate are not congruent with this view of natural selection that characterizes thinking behind the conventional narrative. Natural selection operating very slowly, evolution happening very slowly. So here's an example of how evolution can, also a suggestion of what might be working to hasten evolution. And here it has to do with the identification of a collectively held resource, optimism, identifying also people who are taking themselves out of life, relating that to selection in utero. So on the one hand, conscious decision by women of childbearing age to end their life, which is taken to reflect on the environments that they live in. This is an environment I don't want to live in. And then selection in utero, reflecting on a non-conscious decision biology that refers to the quality of the environment into which a woman might bring a child. This is really out there, I'm afraid. It's maybe not less chewy than what I've already talked about before, but the important point here is that we can talk about a collective resource, the optimism that we share together about a future worth living, and then the evolutionary process that is still going on, that didn't stop on the savannah, that's been continuing. It has its biological and sociocultural aspects.
It sounds very deterministic to me.
Well, it's in an adaptation framework. So I mean, it's
yes, that's right. Yeah. So I like the idea of a collective optimism as a collective, and so how would we translate that into how in a public pandemic we might shift the narrative from one which is about fear and uncertainty to something that would be restorative in your within the context in which you're operating, within your particular narrative.
Yeah, well, you can see in the last sentence in the abstract here, we're identifying collective optimism as a possible component of public health infrastructure.
Yeah.
And if you think about messaging from public health authorities, it's not just everybody's going to die. It's, okay, there are things we can do. We're going to get through this. We have a life worth living after the pandemic, and so forth. So it's
yeah.
In messaging we see from different governmental entities in different countries, it's very much about the concerns of the pandemic, but it's also about keep your chins up. We're going to get through this. We can do this together, and so forth. And so that's in a sense sharing optimism.
I've got Philip has a question first. Philip.
Yeah, hi, Terry. Thanks very much for your talk. This is not really my area at all, so it's probably a naive question, but I'm quite interested in the mechanism here for twins, being selected, I guess, out of the population based on optimistic or non-pessimistic feelings sort of within the population. Do you have a mechanism for how that can occur?
Well, there's a biological black box that we don't engage here. I mean, there is some understanding that male twins are particularly susceptible to the spontaneous abortion as relatively small fetuses that are less likely to contribute grandchildren later on. So these are understandings that we have looking at populations, basically. But there are also the mechanisms that are studied, for example, with rodents, why this might occur. I'm not expert in these particular mechanisms. Ralph Catalano and the other colleagues do have more expertise in this. But there are a variety of converging lines of thinking and research here that speak to the plausibility of this happening.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, it's not so much of an answer, but it's what I can offer you. Thank you for the question.
Welcome.
This is relatively straightforward. One of the important messages coming out of this study, which was done with Swedish parishes, so it's an aggregate study, an ecological study, and it is that in Sweden, we have some parishes that are growing, some that are relatively stable, some that are in decline in terms of population density for the given area. And part of the conventional narrative, as I've described it to you, it has this context-setting problem description that we are urbanizing, we're losing green space, that's bad for health. But what we see in this study is an example where we have urbanization, and in fact, mortality is declining with urbanization in some of these parishes. But the thing is that population is increasing from relatively low levels in those parishes. We have other parishes, relatively few, I have to say, so that it's too small to provide reliable numbers, but they're in decline. So in a sense, nature, if you will, a popular notion of nature, is coming back. But it's coming back in a way that people consider to be threatening. That our communities are in decline. We can't make a living here. We're just old people left out here in the countryside. Our children have moved to the city. So in these circumstances, the increase in nature isn't necessarily a positive thing. So we published this study with limitations of the data as they are, just to make this point that we need to reconcile a story about urbanization and loss of nature being bad for health. We need to reconcile that with the notion of, well, actually in some circumstances, a growing community and urbanization is positive. And loss of these urban qualities, loss of urban amenities can be problematic for health, as represented in mortality.